All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We have quite a big turnout today, so that's very exciting. Probably makes sense considering how many questions we've received about weeding. So we decided to go ahead and make a weeding webinar so that we can give you a little bit more information and some accounts from what we've experienced so far. And hopefully by the end of this, you can also ask any questions that you might have. And we can also share some thoughts and experiences as well. So I'll be going through this for the first half. And then if you have any questions, please try to keep them till the end. Obviously, if there are any burning questions, then please do interrupt me. That's totally fine. And Divya and Daniel will also be interrupting in case I miss anything. This is my first time recording a webinar, but I'm very excited to go on this journey with you guys. Okay, let's get started. So the outline is that we are going to talk about what weeds are roughly and why we would like to weed. We've come up with this policy that is kind of an idea of how long we will be weeding for, and we'll go through that. And then also briefly how to weed, and we'll show you some pictures and examples of what we've seen so far in our tiny forests. And of course, at the end, you'll have the chance to ask any questions or share anything with the rest of us. So what are weeds? So the first thing is there are 3 P's when considering weeds: plant, place, and perception. So what this means is what type of weed we're looking at, where the weeds are situated in the tiny forest, aka how close they are to our tree saplings, and perception meaning how much of a threat do we think that they are to our tiny trees. So typically a weed is something that is considered undesirable, and it is non-woody, so it's typically a herb as well. Now, of course, the word weed in itself has been a little bit divisive even amongst our staff. A lot of people don't always like to use the word weed. There are things that grow in the tiny forest that have flowering plants and buds and seeds and things like that. So not everybody likes to use the word weed, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be referring to it as weeds, just in terms of all the things that are not the trees that we've specifically planted as a community. So they are also usually taller than 5 centimeters in our definition, because typically the taller ones are the ones that we would consider a little bit more threatening to our trees, whereas the smaller ones are flowering herbs and grass that can really help with maintaining the moisture in the soil, and they can also attract pollinators and other wildlife. So we usually just refer to the weeds as being taller than 5 centimeters. So why do we weed? Very good question, if anyone's asked themselves that. So weeds in this specific situation are definitely a competitor of resources for our trees. So they compete in 2 ways. They compete in above ground and below ground. In above ground, they would compete directly for sunlight, for space, and in terms of above ground, we would be worried about our health and safety issues. So competing directly for sunlight, you will see things such as very large leaves. So dock plants will typically have very large leaves sometimes. When they compete for space, they typically grow very tall, and they're just very good at propagating and reproducing. So maybe you've seen this in your own tiny forest, where you come to your tiny forest and you just see weeds everywhere. And they've almost taken up all the space, and you feel like, oh no, I can't even see my saplings right now. That's typically when they're being very competitive. And in terms of health and safety concerns, that is usually for things that might be potentially allergenic. So things like, I'm trying to remember the word for poison ivy, sorry, it's at the tip of my tongue. So poison ivy, for example, would cause something like a bit of an irritation to our skin just because well, it's just irritating. It has like those tiny little hairs. Sorry, just letting somebody in. And so that's something that we would want to be careful with, because especially if we have school children coming in and maybe they don't have that much of an awareness of the different types of weeds, we would want to make sure that we've removed those kind of issue weeds. They also will be competing for resources underneath the ground. So they'll compete for water and nutrients in the soil. And as we know, there is quite a lot of nutrients in the soil because each one of our tiny forests have been prepared with soil supplements, and therefore it is very fertile soil. So that's also why you'll probably find a lot of forests have so many weeds. And they also compete for space. So a lot of them will make sure that they've established themselves underground by rooting a lot. And this would be an issue for our trees that are also trying to establish themselves. So, I'm trying to click the next slide. Ooh, okay. So weeding, the idea of weeding can be a little bit overwhelming if we are, we don't know that much about weeds. And personally, for example, I'm not a botanist. And when I've come across tiny forests, I've also asked myself, how much should I be weeding and where should I be weeding? So in this case, we've developed a policy on weeding. I mean, policy is loosely, it's just kind of some guidelines for how long we should be weeding for and what types of weeding we want to do. So I will take you through that. So in terms of our weeding policy, there are 3 years that we will be monitoring the weeds for and potentially weeding. So the first year is kind of it's called the low tolerance, which means we have low tolerance for weeds because our trees are still very small and they're still trying to establish themselves. Typically, there will be the highest rate of mortality within our saplings. So we want to make sure that we give them a fighting chance, and therefore, most of the weeds that we see in our tiny forests, we want to make sure that we get rid of. Now, that isn't to say that if we see things like wildflowers or tufts of grass here and there, just sparsely all around the forest, that we should just go out and rip them off. I don't personally do that, but of course, I think, as we said, it's also about perception. And, if we're feeling like all these tufts of grass are everywhere, then it would be a good idea to weed them. And so that's kind of the year 1 thing. It's kind of the idea that our trees are just kind of in their most vulnerable position when it comes to their growth. And we want to make sure that, they're not overly having to compete for resources with these weeds. So year 2, so that's usually a year after the planting has been done. So moving on to the second year, we are getting closer to this idea of wanting to look at the size of the weeds and how close they are to the sapling. So maybe your tiny forest will still have some weeds, and that might be okay considering where they are. So if they're very close to the saplings, we want to make sure that we remove the ones that are just very, very close. So what I like to do as well is I kind of consider like a 10 centimeter little border around the sapling. This will also help with the measurement. So if you're doing, for example, any kind of carbon storage measuring, so if you're measuring the height of the tree, you also can see the bottom of the tree. And obviously, if the weeds are any taller than the tree or just taller than 5 centimeters, as we said, we want to make sure we remove those. And year 3 is kind of the idea that at some point, the trees will be tall enough and big enough to kind of outcompete any of the weeds, and they will no longer be needing our assistance. That is also the point of the Miyawaki method, is that it requires relatively low maintenance, if any, depending on the forest. And so year 3 will typically be a lot more relaxed, and we can hopefully start to enjoy our tiny forests and really just start to feel more of the benefits. And so an example for that would be our Whitney forest, which is a forest that was planted in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. It's already grown quite a lot over the last 2 years. 2020, thank you, Daniel. So it's already grown quite a lot over the last 2 years. And it's already grown quite a lot over the last 2 years, and we've actually observed pretty much no weeds. So that should be kind of the idea, and hopefully the other tiny forests will serve as, we'll just follow in our Whitney forest tracks. So I'm just gonna go through some of the examples in pictures of weeds. So for example, in year 1, if you're seeing this amount of weeds growing, you know, it's a good idea to remove, I mean, most of them. We're seeing, you know, some potential barley and wheat over here. So that's definitely something we would want to be removing, just because that requires a lot of nutrients and water because they have seeds. So yes, low tolerance. As you can see here, you know, Divya looking a little bit concerned by all the weeds that we have, but it's quite a nice activity to do, especially when you have a lot of people. Here in this situation, there were quite a lot of children, and it's quite a nice thing to do with children because it's a destructive thing that can like control destruction. And I think, you know, a lot of people can vouch if they have children that destroying things is very fun for them. So that's a really nice activity to do with children as well. So it doesn't always have to be so overwhelming. Now, this is an example of something that I've personally seen yesterday when I was out in the Chad's Grove Primary School, which is one of the 7 Trent forests. This is a bindweed, and it has a little flower on it. Well, as you can see, it's a really pretty flower, but it's important to note that that isn't the flower of our tree. That is actually the bindweed flower. And although it's quite nice, bindweed, so in this case, the bindweed has bound itself around a rose type of plant. And, you know, they're very aggressive with the way that they grow. They will just kind of circle around the plant and pretty much starve it off of any sunlight, especially when it's very small. So yesterday we spent a good 2 hours removing any of these bindweeds because it was just so full of them. And the way that they grow as well and propagate is that you typically have a vertical root. So, sorry, a horizontal root. It's a horizontal root system. And when you're pulling out one of the bindweed vines, it's not always going to be the root that comes out. So a new vine could just come out of that root if you don't actually get to the root of the problem. So you're pulling out quite a lot of bindweeds. But as long as you're doing it on a regular basis and just making sure that they don't climb up the saplings, you should be fine. I mean, that was the case for us. It took us a couple of hours and we were 3 people. But honestly, the forest was full of bindweed. So definitely low tolerance for those ones, even though they're very beautiful. Yes?
May, do you want to touch upon untangling the vine before pulling?
So yeah, for sure. Thank you, Divya. So yes, indeed. It's important not to grab them from the bottom and just tug because they will be very attached to the sapling. So what I would do is I would just kind of find the top of the bindweed and untangle it slowly around the tree before I try to uproot it. So that way I'm not actually harming the tree or uprooting the tree itself. So yes, if you see that, make sure that you're just a little bit more careful, because they are very tightly they're just hugging the trees. They are the true tree huggers. Okay, now again, another example we have here. All these brown things would be considered weeds. However, because a lot of them have kind of like seeds and things like that, we just want to make sure that there's a bit of a trade-off. So, you know, if they're very close to our saplings, definitely we would be removing them. If they're very high in comparison to the saplings, also. But because some of us could consider them maybe flowering plants and not so much of a nuisance, we might want to leave a few of them. Honestly, it is definitely a trade-off between, you know, making sure that our trees have enough resources, but also wanting to maintain the biodiversity of the tiny forest, because alongside these plants, you know, we also get pollinators, we get ground dwellers, we get all sorts of lovely things as well. So this is an example of a weed that we would definitely want to remove. So like these kind of big leaves, dock leaves, you know, especially if they're very close to our saplings, definitely want to take them out. And finally, this is a nice image of, well, this is a ground image that Daniel took from the bottom of our Whitney forest, and it really looks like a fully grown forest already. And this is an example of how high the trees have grown in our Whitney forest. So as you can see, you know, in 2 years, they've already gone past our heads, and we've actually observed very, very little weeds in that forest. So that's great. So here is hopefully what your tiny forest will look like as well in 2 to 3 years. And it's important to note as well that some of the forests have mulch that is straw mulch. That's how we started off mulching our tiny forests. And we've decided to move away from that and do wood chip mulch. So the reason for that being that our straw mulch had started to sprout and kind of created this barley field at times. And, you know, that's definitely considered a weed, and it would definitely competes for resources. So we've moved on to wood chips, and, you know, hopefully that within itself, you know, the idea of mulch is to have minimal weeds growing. But I've already seen personally that the wood chip has been quite good at keeping the weeds at bay. Oh, so this is a picture of a video of our Whitney forest. And someone is emerging. I wonder who it is. It's Hannah. So this is just an example to show how high the trees are in comparison to Hannah, who is not a very short person. In fact, I believe she is 5'6". That is a gross estimate. I'm not entirely sure how tall she is. Okay. So finally, we're just going to talk a little bit about how to weed. This is important because we don't want to be hurting ourselves or injuring ourselves in the process. So usually weeding would require removing the roots, so pulling out the roots. We want to uproot the actual plant and then trample down to make sure that the ground remains even. Now, some of these things can be difficult with uprooting. I've personally realized that grass, even though it doesn't grow that deep, like its root systems don't go that deep, they can be very wide. So then I typically bunch up all the grass together like hair, and I do this kind of rocking motion. Yeah, it's not great. if you have back issues, but depending on how deep things are and how difficult they look, just do your best. Everybody has different mobilities and abilities. So yes, we definitely want to be pulling it out from the root, and we definitely want to make sure that we don't uproot saplings. I mean, that's definitely easier said than done, because it is sometimes quite difficult, especially if they're very close to the weeds. Now, in terms of barley, we always want to make sure that if we see any of the barley, we want to remove specifically the seeds. So if we see any kind of like, I don't know what they're called, but catkins maybe, or no,
seed heads,
weed heads, sure,
seed heads, yeah,
seed heads, yeah. if anything, we want to remove that, because that takes up a lot of nutrients. So that's really when we have like a full-on forest and there's maybe just 2 of us or something, and we want to consider how much time we have and how much resources we have. Maybe not everybody will have a pair of gloves that day, or maybe it's a very hot day and we don't want to be spending too much time outside. So, just making sure that we are prioritizing, obviously, our health and our safety, and also just doing the best that we can when there are overwhelming weeds. And then we also want to, once we have the weed, put it on the edge of the forest. So that's quite nice, because it'll kind of start to become part of the soil at some point when it decomposes and feed back into the tiny forest ecosystem. But we can also take it back home and shred it for compost. It all depends on what you want to do. Personally, with the bindweed, it has become my #1 enemy. I throw it very far away. So I put them all in bunches together, and I just kind of make sure that they're nowhere near the tiny forest, because they're very good at like recolonizing, basically. So yeah, that is the guideline, more or less. And of course, if we have things like, poison ivy, want to be wearing gloves, definitely, because that will be a very prickly situation. And if we do see poison ivy, it's quite good to have it removed, because that way, nobody is trampling on it or just brushing past it, especially not children. Like, we don't want that. So yes.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, sorry, it's Julia.
Hi,
I just
Julia.
wondered, what does poison ivy look like specifically?
Oh, good question. Yes.
I could try pulling out an image and
yeah, that would be
pop it in chat.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Divya. Great. So while Divya is doing that, I will just go through a little bit more of how to weed. So yes, as previously mentioned, we want to maybe bring some gardening gloves and a trowel. The trowel makes it much easier to, uproot. And yes, also as previously mentioned, we want to consider how long we're in the tiny forest for and what we want to achieve, how many people we have. Someone had mentioned, I think this was Maka's account, that clearing a completely barley-ridden tiny forest took 4 people, and it took them 3 hours to do. So that's a considerable amount of time that you would be spending in the tiny forest. But I guess it's kind of a nice payoff if you won't be doing that much later on and you want to have activities, perhaps. So as I said, getting children involved because they love weeding. It can also be a lovely mindful activity. Absolutely. I think it's always such a nice thing to just be touching any kind of plants and, feeling like you're doing something for your tiny forest and just really feeling like you're, I don't know, helping the saplings grow. And it's a nice feeling. I've done it quite a lot of times. And you can also make it an event, so really just making it a thing amongst people who want to weed. Quite a lot of people enjoy this kind of activity. Not everyone does, but you know, for the ones who do, it's a lovely way to get involved. So here are some more pictures and examples. In this case, you know, as you can see, the weeds have grown quite long, as you can see with these tufts of wheat/barley. And then locating weeds, so knowing what they would look like. So we've had this image before, but of course, as I've mentioned, because they have seeds in them, not everybody would necessarily consider them weeds, but making sure that we know where they stand in comparison to our saplings. And then some more weeds over here. You should have maybe seen this in the images that Divya made about weeding in the past. More weeds, lots of weeds. Ah, yes, this is a weed, not a tree. Oh. And these are also weeds. I mean, surprisingly. And since these flowers are so large and there's so many of them, you know, we would definitely want to make sure that we're removing some, if not most of them, because they are competing for nutrients. So that is the end of the presentation. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much, Divya, for creating these slides. You know, I think these images have been very good examples of what we've seen so far in this monitoring season. And of course, now I'm going to open the floor up to any questions, concerns, or comments. Thank you for listening.